First of all, the prodigal teacher has come home. I'll be home the rest of the Tuesdays in the semester. So we have 5 classes in a row to finish the class. So at least that will go good. Yeah. Praise the Lord for that. So, last week you saw by the miracle of video the class on the missing piece of the new covenant. And the way I kind of regard that is one of the missing pieces of the new covenant in that sense is the church. Because the church wasn't prophesied before. I gave you what I think is probably a provocative idea that theoretically the end could have come in the first century. If Israel would have turned, if Israel would have repented, especially at the leadership level, it could have been very different. But obviously they didn't, so it's entirely hypothetical. But it brings us back to the idea that God revealed the church. Probably, I didn't think about it in these terms, it's just kind of passing through my mind, probably because God did not want to prophesy the widespread rejection of Jesus. Because then it would kind of preordain it in that sense. But anyway, that's all just kind of hypothetical thinking. God brought in the church, which was declared to be a mystery in previous ages, but has now been revealed to us. And now we're dealing with this idea, this institution of the church. Now, seeing that missing piece of the new covenant, the parts that are going to be completed, we see that Israel is going to be gathered spiritually together under the Messiah, and you're going to have the reign of Jesus the Messiah over the whole earth. Excuse me. God brought forth this idea of the church. So tonight, what we're going to talk about is Israel, the church, and Daniel's 70 weeks. I think that these 3 concepts really help shape and lay a foundation for what we're going to talk about tonight and over the next 4 weeks as we come together and talk about these prophetic ideas. So the first thing we want to do is appreciate the general division of the prophetic times. The Bible speaks of 2 general times prophetically. One of them is known as the time of the Gentiles. That's referred to in Luke chapter 21 and in Romans chapter 11. But again, we're talking about the times of the Gentiles and then the times of Israel. These are the 2 different divisions of prophetic time. Now, I should stop right here. I don't know if you've heard the term before or if you understand the term or if you care about the term. It's the term dispensationalist. Now, a dispensationalist, technically, is anybody who regards a difference between the church and Israel. If you buy this, that God has a time in his plan, a portion for the Gentiles, and that he has a time in his plan, a portion to the Jews, to Israel, if you believe that, you are a dispensationalist. Now, there are all different categories of dispensationalism, and all different kinds. Some of them I think are absolutely wacky. Absolutely wacky. There are dispensationalists who teach that, for example, the Sermon on the Mount doesn't apply to Christians. You don't even need to read it. That's only for the Jewish people. Things like that. I think that that's taking the basic concept of dispensationalists and twisting it and extending it way too far. Nevertheless, if you just come back down to this, of agreeing that there is a distinction between Israel and the church, I think that that's an absolutely critical distinction to make, and I think it's a distinction that we need to really understand if we're going to understand anything about God's plan. So, time of the Gentiles, time given over to the Jews. Let's talk about this concept of the time given over to the Gentiles. Here's Luke chapter 21, verse 24. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, I suppose there's a lot of different ideas as to what actually fulfills and those ideas, but you can't deny that that verse, Jesus speaks of a time given over to the Gentiles. That there is this concept of the times of the Gentiles. And basically he says is that Jerusalem will be under Gentile control until that time. I would argue, maybe somebody would disagree with me, I would argue that Jerusalem is still under that situation. Especially the most important part of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, is still under Gentile governance. I don't know if you know, but Israel, the state of Israel, has delegated control of the Temple Mount to a Arab authority. Is it called the Waqf? Yeah. They're the ones who administrate the business of the Temple Mount. And so I would argue that still Jerusalem is undertrod by the Gentiles. It still has not come into the fullness of what God has promised for it in under the new covenant. Here's another aspect where this idea is put forth. Romans chapter 11, verse 25. For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Now notice this again. The key to the fullness of the Gentiles, or the time of the Gentiles, is when Israel takes full possession of Jerusalem again, when they're restored to the land properly, when Israel has the veil taken away, and they understand, when God turns his attention back upon Israel, then the time of the Gentiles will be over. The fullness of the Gentiles will be fulfilled. And we don't know exactly what that means or how long it is, but God has this period of the time of the Gentiles, which I would say we are in right now, but there will come a time when God turns his prophetic focus back upon Israel, and it'll go back into the concept of the time of Israel. Okay, does everybody understand that? Now, let me ask you this. Well, no, hold off. We're going to hold off on that question. It's not a question, it's a statement. Now, the time of the Gentiles doesn't mean that Jews cannot be saved during this time. It does not mean that God is not moving or working among the Jews. What it means is that the Jewish nation is not the focus of God's prophetic plan in the same way that it will be later. Now, at the end of this time, God will turn a special focus upon Israel again, and there will be a massive coming of the Jewish people to Jesus Christ, part of completing the new covenant. We'll see what this will end with, and we'll see it as we point out today. The time will be noted as ended when a future political leader, known by many people as the Antichrist, but that's really not the best name for him, but this future political leader will make a covenant with Israel to guarantee their security and their freedom. And to me, when I look around the world today, when I see the establishment of the nation of Israel, modern evangelistic success among the Jewish people, it indicates that the time of the Gentiles is drawing to a close. Now, some people call the time of the Gentiles the church age. I don't know if that's a great title or not. I'm just kind of telling you. I prefer, whenever possible, I like using biblical phrases. And since times of the Gentiles is a biblical phrase, I'm going to use that instead of saying church age. Okay, any question before we move on and start talking about the times of Israel? Yes, Doug.
The time of the Gentiles begin with the Assyrians and Babylonians?
No. I believe, as we're going to see tonight, I believe that the time of the Gentiles began with the rejection of Jesus by the Jewish people. Yeah. And I mean, if I really wanted to get fancy on it, I could probably give you a date. I know some people would suggest a specific date. But no, we'll see. Well, I'll just kind of give you the broad framework. The time of the Gentiles actually happens in a pause given of the time of the times given to Israel. God apportioned a time to Israel. It was enacted, went for a long period, then it paused, and it will resume later, and in between, in that pause, is when the time of the Gentiles is. Any other question? All right, let's take a look at the time of the Jews. Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27 tell us, and by the way, if we had more time, we'd go into the book of Daniel and chapter 9 as a whole. Chapter 9 in the book of Daniel is one of the most wonderful chapters in the entire Bible. Not only for the prophecy that we're going to take a look at here in Daniel chapter 9, but it's also such a wonderful chapter in the Bible for the prayer that Daniel prays. Daniel's prayer in Daniel chapter 9 is just one of the most wonderful, one of the most beautiful prayers in the entire Bible. And it's a prayer with a lot of insight, with a lot of, just power to it. So anyway, in Daniel chapter 9, we're going to begin at verse 24. But let's start at verse 20, okay, just to warm up to this, okay? Starting at verse 20. Now, while I was speaking, praying, and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I've now come forth to give you skill to understand. At the beginning of your supplications, the command went out, and I've come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved, therefore consider the matter and understand the vision. Okay, so you got to say it's pretty amazing. Daniel's praying a prayer, and Gabriel comes to bring him the answer. That's pretty good. Well, Gabriel seems oftentimes to be associated with Israel and with things that God is going to do in the prophetic plan for Israel. So Gabriel comes to bring the specific message to Daniel, and we're going to start talking, verse 24, what it is, but understand that this came in response to a remarkable prayer that Daniel made. Okay? Verse 24. And I'll just read the entire thing, and then we'll take a look at it verse by verse. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. After the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with the flood, until the end of the war desolations are determined. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Okay, sometimes I can't decide whether this prophecy that God gave Daniel through the angel Gabriel, sometimes I have a hard time understanding if it's simple or complicated. And I think this is what it is. It's actually a very simple prophecy, but because it's phrased in Hebrew idioms, that's where we trip up with it. But if you can kind of simplify and understand the Hebrew idioms and phrases of speech that are used in it, it's a very simple, straightforward prophecy, not terribly mysterious. It tells us very clearly what's going to happen. So are we ready to tear this apart piece by piece? Here we go. Verse 24, let's just take a look at the first part of the verse. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. All right, when you take a look at that, how long is 70 weeks? How many days is 70 weeks? Do we have any rocket scientists in the group? 490 days, okay? Because 70 times 7 equals 490, okay? Oh, I just remembered there's something I should have printed out for you guys. I gotta, wait, Cameron, here. We'll hand this out a little bit later, but once you print out one of those, make a copy of one of those for everybody. Okay, 70 times 7 is 490. Here's the difficulty, okay? Are we talking about a week right there? We understand to be a unit of 7 days. Does everybody understand that? A week we understand to be a unit of 7 days. Here's the problem. In the ancient Hebrew, the phrase that's used doesn't mean a unit of 7 days. It simply means a unit of 7. We don't have the exact equivalent in our language. We have something close. The term dozen. Dozen means 12, right? 12 what? I'm not talking about a baker's dozen either. Okay. 12. 12 what? Well, it depends on the context. If I were to say to you, 70 dozens are determined for your people and for your holy city, you'd say, dozens of what? A dozen eggs? A dozen days? A dozen years? Which is it? Now, in the context here, I think there's only one way to understand this, especially in its fulfillment, that when he says week there, it's a reference to a unit of 7 years. Now, I know to us, as we translate the Bible, we look at that and just kind of say, oh, well, the most simple way to understand it is days. Well, no, that's just because we're reading our idea of the word week there. All the Hebrew means is a unit of 7, period. Sometimes it means 7 days, sometimes it means 7 years. I can show you verses in the Old Testament where it's used sometimes for 7 days and sometimes for 7 years in the same context. For example, Genesis chapter 29, verses 15 through 28, in that same context, sometimes it's used for 7 days, sometimes it's used for 7 years. It's the same ancient Hebrew word used for that. Okay, so does everybody understand? We're talking about 70 units of 7. And who are they for? Look at verse 24. 70 weeks are determined for your people. Who's your people? The Jews. And for your holy city. What's your holy city? Nobody say Santa Barbara. It's Jerusalem. Okay? So, 490, now I'll just cut to the chase right here, years. I could play along like we really don't know, and say, but forget about the playing along. 490 years are determined for your holy people, and 490 years are determined for the Jews and Jerusalem. Now, just pause right here. Don't you see that this is a description of the times of the Gentiles? Excuse me, the time of the Jews. Just as much as Jesus and Paul spoke very clearly about, that'll be a little while yet, Cameron, we'll do that. Just as much as they spoke very clearly about the time of the Gentiles, this is clear speaking about the time of the Jews. Now again, it's very clear. The Hebrew idioms and phrases trip us up a little bit, but if we can get past the Hebrew idioms, he's saying there's going to be a time for the Jews, 490 years for the Jews and for their city. Okay, great, good, we're on that. That's what we're talking about. Now, again, this brings us back to this important distinction. There is a difference between Israel and the church. Let me say this in Romans 11:25 and 26. For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, that you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has come to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel shall be saved. When the fullness of Gentiles has come in, and God turns his redemptive focus on Israel once again, then Israel will be saved. They'll no longer think of Israel as a Jesus-rejecting people, but as a Jesus-accepting people. Now again, this clear statement tells us beyond any doubt that God is not finished with Israel as Israel. He's got a work for them to do. These promises that God made again and again to Israel, they're real, they matter, and we understand there is a continuity of God's work through all generations and through all ages. There is a difference between the church and Israel. Do we understand that? But the church and Israel are not different in every way. They're still the people of God. There is a continuity among the company of the redeemed throughout every age, throughout every time. So we don't want to exaggerate the difference between Israel and the church and act as if they are different in every way. They're not different in every way. There's some ways in which they are alike, and we kind of rejoice in them. Okay. Now, any questions so far before we go on to the next part of verse 24? We're still in the first verse here, verse 24. Notice this. What is going to be accomplished in the 70 weeks? 490 years. What's going to happen? We know that 490 years are apportioned to Israel. What's going to happen in those 490 years? Well, there's a list. Number 1, to finish the transgression. Number 2, to make an end of sins. Number 3, to make reconciliation for iniquity. Number 4, to bring in everlasting righteousness. Number 5, to seal up vision and prophecy. Number 6, to anoint the most holy. It's right there in the verse. In 490 years, this is going to take place over that span. Now, one of the significant debates among Christians when they discuss this business is, are these things fulfilled right now or not? Are they fulfilled or not? By the way, when we're talking about these things of eschatology, and you'll probably hear me say this tonight and over the next 4 weeks a lot, you understand, don't you, that there are good Christians who really love the Lord who have different opinions about these things. There are wonderful believers who really love Jesus, who if they were here in this room tonight, they would just have their head in their hands the whole time. I can't believe Guzik is going on about this. He doesn't understand it at all. This is a completely different thing. Doesn't he understand it's fulfilled? What's he talking about? Listen, I understand that there's beautiful Christians who really love the Lord who would not agree with how I'm presenting this here tonight. And what I say to those beautiful Christians who love the Lord, God bless you. God gives you the right to be wrong on these things. I mean, now, and you know what? I hope they would say the same thing to me. Really? I mean, isn't it true? I want to walk a line. On the one hand, I really do respect my fellow brothers and sisters who disagree on these things. And I don't want to act like these things are the core of the Christian life or that. I want to keep them on perspective. But neither do I want to act like, gee, I don't really know what I believe, and it could be this or it could be that. I think I know what I believe with all this stuff. And so I'm teaching you how I understand it. So yes, we respect those who have a different opinion or anything, but I'm not I'm not tortured about this. I feel like it explains the biblical evidence pretty well. Okay, so let's go through here, and I want you guys to say yes or no as to if things were fulfilled. Let's begin with an easy one. To make reconciliation for iniquity. Yes or no, has that been fulfilled in time and history? Where did it get fulfilled? At the cross. Okay? At the cross, this was fulfilled. How about this one? To bring in everlasting righteousness. Well, that's a little tough, because it really does depend how you want to define everlasting righteousness. And no, actually, it more so has a, how do you want to define bring in? You know? Does he mean just put a foot in? Because I would say everlasting righteousness was instituted at the cross. But are you talking about it bringing in the sense of its completion? No way. So that one, it's a little bit on the bubble. Maybe it was fulfilled, maybe not. Okay? To anoint the most holy. To be honest, I don't know exactly what that one means, other than it's speaking of the temple or God's heavenly equivalent of the temple in heaven. Yes?
My understanding, I saw a video about it, the most holy would be the Ark of the Covenant, and on the east side was where Jesus' blood was supposed to anoint the most holy, and on the west side they had animal sacrifices that they anointed the Ark of the Covenant.
Well, now, this would be true, that this could have been fulfilled by the work of Jesus on the cross, at least as it was received in heaven. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't in the temple in Jesus' day, so that makes that a little bit tougher. But theoretically, that could have been fulfilled when, if you take the most holy to be the heavenly reality that the temple illustrated, then you could say that okay, so this, yes. This, maybe. This, maybe. Okay, how about this one? To finish the transgression. I don't think you can look around the world today and say transgression is finished. How about this? To make an end of sins. I don't think you can look around the world and say that. How about this one? To seal up vision and prophecy. Look, this is talking about the fulfillment of all things. This is talking about wherever this ends, it has to end with the enthronement of the Messiah. The Messiah enthroned. Now, is Jesus enthroned as the Messiah today? Absolutely, there's a sense in which he is, a sense. But in the fullness of what it speaks about in the New Testament and the Old Testament, no way. No way. You know, sometimes theologians will talk about this. The idea that the kingdom is here, but not yet. There's a sense in which the kingdom is here, absolutely, but there's also a large sense in which it is not yet. When I read this list, I don't have any problem with saying this talks about the fulfillment, where the not yet is also fulfilled, where Jesus is enthroned as king, Messiah of king over all the earth. That's where this has to end up. Now notice this. All this has to take place within the 490 years. Gabriel told Daniel that all of these things would happen within 490 years. I think you can only say that this list is fulfilled if you ignore its plain literal meaning. I believe lots of people do ignore its plain literal meaning, and that's why they say it's fulfilled. But I don't read it as being fulfilled at all. Okay, so you must say, great. we haven't reached the end of the 490 years. So when did these 490 years start? Had to be less than 490 years ago, right? Well, yes and no. He's going to tell us when the 490 years started. Ready for this? Verse 25. The course and the dividing of the 70 weeks. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. Okay, here we go. Gabriel clearly revealed to Daniel the starting point for the 70 weeks prophecy. There would be a command to restore and build Jerusalem that would begin this specific period of time. When was it? Well, there's actually a few potential ones given in Scripture. There's a command for the rebuilding of the temple. There's actually a couple issuings for the rebuilding of the temple. But there's really only one when Artaxerxes makes a decree giving Nehemiah permission and safe passage and supplies to return Jerusalem to build the city and the walls. If you'll notice, verse 25 makes no mention of the temple. This is about rebuilding the city and the walls. He did it in 445 BC. Matter of fact, we can even say that we know the date of that in 445 BC. I believe it's March 1st, 445 BC, is the date in which that would have happened. So there was a command to restore and build Jerusalem. So from this starting point, what happens next? Just look at verse 25. Just read it carefully, and I think it's very clear. That from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. Do you see what he's saying there? All right. 62 plus 7 equals... So we have a total group. The big group is 70 weeks. Here he's talking about something that happens within 69 of those 70 weeks. What is 69 times 7? 483. Do you understand what Gabriel told Daniel? Gabriel said, when you see on the calendar this decree to go forth and rebuild Jerusalem, 483 years later, the Messiah, the Prince, will be there. You got to admit, it's a pretty amazing prophecy, don't you think? 483 years from the time this decree is made, the Messiah will come. Now, what happened at the end of 483 years, counting from March 1st, 445 BC? Well, some people say that the 483 years were completed at the birth of Jesus. There's not a lot of chronological verification for that. Some say the 483 years were completed at his baptism. Probably not. There's some finagling that some people do. Probably not. Probably the best way to approach it is to say that the 483 years were completed at the triumphal entry of Jesus. Cameron, let's pass those out now. We're going to go through the calculations made by a guy named Sir Robert Anderson. I need to be entirely straightforward with you. What I'm going to share with you now is not agreed to by everybody. I would even describe it, in all fairness, as a minority opinion. You'll find more scholars who disagree with this than scholars who do disagree with it. However, I believe that what Sir Robert Anderson brings forth in this has not been disproven. I don't think anybody has categorically shown, no, because of this and this, there's no way that this can be true. And it's pretty awesome. Do we have an extra one around here? Because I need to look at one. Thanks, Cameron. Okay, let's just walk ourselves through this sheet together. Ready? From the decree to rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of the king, according to Daniel 9, 24 and 25, will be 7 plus 62 weeks, equaling 69 groups of 7 years. 7 times 69 equals 483 years. Okay, is that clear to everybody? Anderson, first of all, said, what is a year? He took a year as being what the ancient world regarded as a year, and that's 360 days. He calls it a prophetic year. It's kind of interesting. All the ancient calendars were built on a 360-day year. There are people who argue that the year cycle at the earth was at one time 360 days and not 364. That's a whole nother argument, but I'm just saying, Anderson takes the basis for his calculation to be 360-day years, because that's what Daniel would have considered. When Gabriel told Daniel, that's exactly what he would have figured, 360 days years. There's also biblical evidence for that as well. Now, if you take 483 times 360, you end up with 173,880 days. Artaxerxes started his reign in 465 BC. The decree to rebuild Jerusalem was given on the first day of Nisan in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. In our calendar system, the Julian, that date is March 14th. I said it was the first. I made an error. March 14th, 445 BC. Okay? That's when the decree was given. Jesus started his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius. Tiberius started his reign in 14 AD, so Jesus' ministry started in AD 29. Now, here's where it gets a little bit controversial and where people disagree with Anderson. I'm just saying, here's where some of the chronology people disagree with. Anderson believes that Jesus celebrated 4 Passovers during his ministry, one each in 29, 30, 31, and his final Passover in 32. 3 years of ministry, but covering 4 Passovers, essentially starting at a Passover and ending at a Passover. So there were 4 Passovers in 3 years. The date of ancient Passovers can be calculated by lunar charts, so it's possible to calculate the exact day of Jesus' triumphal entry as April 6, AD 32. Okay, if Jesus did die in AD 32, then you can figure out from when Passover was there and the day he died. So, from 445 BC to AD 32 is 476 Julian years. It's not 477 because there is no year 0. Then there's an adjustment. From March 14th to April 6th, you add 24 days. Then you make an adjustment for the leap years in the period. You add 116 days. Then the total number of days from March 14th, 445 BC, to April 6, AD 32 is 173,880 days, exactly the number of days prophesied by Daniel. Now, these are pretty impressive calculations. And Sir Robert Anderson was a brilliant astronomer and mathematician. Not everybody agrees with these, but it would be pretty awesome if Jesus presented himself as Messiah the King to Israel on the exact day, 483 years later, that this prophecy began. It would be remarkable, you'd have to agree. And when you think about it, there's something different about Jesus' triumphal entry. So often in the other instances of Jesus' life, when he does a spectacular miracle, What's Jesus often doing? He's saying, keep it quiet. Don't tell anybody. My time has not yet come. That's what he's often doing, isn't he? It's the direct opposite on the day of the triumphal entry. On the day of triumphal entry, he's like, bring it on. Matter of fact, Jesus said that if the people stopped praising him on that day, that the rocks would cry out. It's like Jesus said that this was a unique day in his life and in his ministry when he was being formally offered to Israel as Messiah and King. As he said in the verses I put down at the bottom, if you had known, even you especially, this your day, the things that make for your peace. And David said of this day prophetically in Psalm 118, this is the day which the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. So that's what happened on that day, Messiah the Prince. This was the only day in Jesus' entirely earthly ministry where he presents himself openly and publicly as king to Israel. So you got to say it's pretty impressive. A Gentile king made a decree, and 483 years later, exactly, Messiah the Prince comes to Israel. So, the 70 weeks are thus divided into 3 parts. Okay, number 1, 7 weeks, that is 49, until the city and its walls are rebuilt. Number 2, 69 weeks, 7 plus 62, 483 years from the decree until Messiah the Prince appears, and then a final 70th week to complete the prophecy. Okay, is everybody clear on that so far? Any questions? Now let's look at verse 26. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Now again, please look carefully at verse 26. Excuse me. Please look carefully at verse 26. We need to look at it phrase by phrase. First of all, after the 62 weeks, how many units of 7 are we talking about then? I'm trying to confuse you. What did you say? Why? But it says 62 in verse 26. That's right, exactly so. We've already dealt with the 7. Then you add to it a 62. So now our running total is 69. Has everybody got that? First there were 7. Then there were 62. The running total is 69. So after the 483 years, the 69 weeks, what's going to happen? Messiah shall be cut off. Now, I just want you to pause there and think about it. What a staggering prophecy this is. Not only did Daniel prophesy that Messiah the Prince would come exactly when he did come, but he also prophesied that he would be rejected and executed. That's an amazing prophecy. Daniel says, I'm going to tell you exactly when he's coming, and I'm going to tell you that when he does come, he's going to be cut off, he's going to be executed. Now that term, cut off, sometimes in the Old Testament, it's used just for being excommunicated among God's people. But other times it's used for being not excommunicated, but for being executed. And that's the sense of it here. Messiah is going to be killed as a criminal after the 483 years are completed. Okay, is everybody following? But then look at the next phrase. Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. It won't be his fault. He'll be executed, but he won't be a criminal. He won't be the bad guy, even though he's going to be executed. Okay, are we all clear on that? Next line. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay, first of all, what's the city? What's the sanctuary? The temple. The people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Who destroyed the city and the temple? Right, the Romans. Now, it doesn't say, look carefully there, does it say that the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary? Does it say that? No. It says the people of. Now, what I want you to notice is verse 26 introduces us to somebody else. You have Messiah the Prince, correct? We understand him. He comes at the end of the 69 weeks. He is executed. But then we have a second person. The second person is the Prince who is to come. What do we know about the Prince who is to come so far? What? We know one thing about him so far. Exactly. We know who his people are.
And what they did.
Yeah, and what they did. But that says what they did. That doesn't tell us anything about the prince himself. But we know that the prince who is to come has a connection with Rome. Correct? Okay? So, the people of the prince, so after the Messiah comes, after the Messiah is executed, some people are going to destroy Jerusalem and the temple. There is a prince who is to come later that's going to come from those people, but those people are going to destroy the city and the sanctuary. And it's going to be nasty when it happens. Look at the last phrase of verse 26. And the end of it shall be with a flood, and the end of the war, desolations are determined. It's going to be a wipeout, which was fulfilled exactly in 70 AD. Okay? So are we clear so far? Any questions about this? Verse 26, again, it's actually very simple and straightforward, but because of the sort of Hebraic phrasing, it's easy to get lost in the weeds. But this is what we know from verse 26. We know the Messiah is going to be executed. We know that it won't be his fault. We know that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And we know that there's a prince who is to come who will be associated with the same people who destroyed Jerusalem. Okay, is everybody clear on that? Give me your nodding head. Okay, good, good. Now verse 27. We're just walking through this passage verse by verse. Verse 27. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate. Okay? I know I read that verse and go, what? Wings? Abominations? What's this? No, again, it's very simple. You just got to go through it slow and weed through the Hebraic phrasing. Let's begin here just word by word. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many. The first thing we've got to start with, who's the he? The Messiah? The prince who is to come. Okay? So everybody have that. Verse 27, he is the prince who is to come. Okay, so we're going to learn something about this prince who is to come. What is he going to do? He's going to confirm a covenant, make a treaty, confirm a covenant with many. Now we got to pause here because our English Bible translation, by the way, when I was in Ukraine last week, last Tuesday I was teaching this Bible college class. I was teaching it in Ukraine for mission school. I taught the whole class on Tuesday and Wednesday last week. I taught 6 sessions a day, both Tuesday and Wednesday. And we got through the whole class in 2 days. So it's the same in the Ukrainian Bible as in the English Bible, I can tell you that. It's not a good translation in the English Bible because literally in the Hebrew it is, he shall confirm a covenant with the many. It's not just many various, it's a specific many. And in the context, it's Israel. The many, Israel. He shall confirm a covenant with Israel. Okay, who's the he again? What do we know about the prince who is to come? He's connected with the Romans somehow. Some kind of connection with the Romans. The prince who is to come, he's going to confirm a covenant with Israel for how long? Okay, now wait a minute. How many total units of 70 are we dealing with in the prophecy? 70. How many have we already accounted for? So how many do we have left over? Here's our one left. With this one last one, we've reached our 70. It goes 7 plus 62 plus 1 equals 70. Here's our last week. Here is the 70th week of Daniel, the last 77-year period. Okay, is everybody, I mean, again, it's not complicated if we walk through it. Then he shall confirm a covenant with the many. Then the prince who is to come shall make a covenant with Israel for 7 years. Okay, clear enough? But in the middle of the week, how long would the middle of the week be? Okay, 3.5 years. He shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Okay, first of all, that tells you sacrifice and offering is going on. You can't bring an end to something that's not going on. It also tells you that if this is in a Jewish context, there is a temple and an altar where sacrifice and offering is being made. You have a temple, it's functioning. The prince who is to come makes a stop sacrifice and offering in the middle of the week, in the middle of the 7 years, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate. Okay, a couple things to guide you with here. Number one, abominations. Abominations is a very specific word used in the ancient Hebrew to refer to a terrible idolatry, a mega idolatry. If you just go through it, we've seen it as we study through Jeremiah all the time. He talks about your abominations. What he's talking about is your idols. So what is he going to do? There's going to be a terrible idolatry that's going to bring desolation behind it. You could say a Super Bowl championship brings a celebration behind it. You know, it's associated with it. This is going to be a terrible idolatry that in the aftermath of it, it brings desolation with it. All right? So there's going to be a terrible idolatry. The idolatry is going to be connected to a temple because there has to be temple and sacrifice and offering is stopped. It's going to be done in the halfway through this last 7-year period, and it's going to be done by a guy who has an association with the Romans. Did everybody get that? Now, if we take the description of what was going to be accomplished in the 70 weeks from verse 24, that list of 6 things, we know that the 70 weeks are not yet complete. What was fulfilled in the first 69 weeks, it happened, but now there's a lengthy pause between the 69th week and the 70th week. The 70th week will begin when? What starts the 70th week? Look at verse 26. What is it? Yeah. Verse 27. When the prince who is to come makes a covenant with Israel. That's what begins the the 70th week. Now, the idea of gaps or pauses in prophecies, that might sound strange to us. How could you give a prophecy and all of this is fulfilled, then the pause button is pushed, and then the rest of it is fulfilled? It sounds strange to us, but it's actually a very common thing. I don't know if I should give you an example or not. All right, turn to Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government there will be, and peace there will be no end upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order and establish it with justice and judgment, with this time forth, even forever. One prophecy encompassing both returns, both comings of Jesus. Do you see, in one prophecy, you have part of it fulfilled in the first coming, part of it fulfilled in the second coming. That's a 2,000-year gap. Again, here we have one prophecy with a large pause button passed. Here is one way you can think of it. That it's like a giant stopwatch. And God apportioned 490 years on the stopwatch. I should have got somebody and go into Photoshop and put like 490 up there. And what God did was, when Artaxerxes made his thing, he started the stopwatch. And he counted off 483 years. When Israel did not receive Jesus at the end of the 483 years, he stopped the stopwatch and he said, okay, now it's the time of the Gentiles. But when the time of the Gentiles is over, click, and it begins the last 7 years. Okay? It's actually a fairly simple concept when you get down to it, and that's what God's doing. In the total span of the 493 years, all these things are fulfilled and completed, but there's still this one aspect to go. Now, this 7-year period is so prominent in prophecy that there are repeated references to it, usually in one of its halves. And in other passages of Scripture we see this. First of all, I understand, Daniel divided the 7 years in half. Did he not? How did he do that? What's the phrasing? He says, in the middle of the week, that's when the prince who is to come is going to shut down sacrifice and offering and do this terrible idolatry. So look at this. Daniel 7:25 speaks a time and times and half a time. Now again, that sounds complicated to it. It's just Hebrew phrasing. Count with me. A time, 1 year, times 2 years, half a time, half a year. That's my thumb. What do you add up to? 3.5. Time and times and half time is just a Hebraic way of saying 3.5. If you would say times and half a time, you'd be talking about 4.5. But here you're talking about 3.5. Time, times, and half a time. That's Daniel 7:27. Daniel 12:7 refers to a time and times and half a time. 3.5 years. Revelation 11:2, for 42 months. How long is 42 months? 3.5 years. Revelation 11:3, 1,260 days. If you have a 360-day calendar, how long is 1,260 days? 3.5 years. Revelation 12:6, 1,260 days. Revelation 12:13, 14, a time and times and half a time. Revelation 13:5, for 42 months. Isn't it interesting? How often the prophetic scriptures speak to this 7-year period in one of its halves. okay, in one of its halves. That's why this is such an important framework to talk about. Now, what happens in between the 69th and the 70th week? Well, Jerusalem is conquered. And we have the time of the Gentiles. God is waiting for that time to be fulfilled. It's when the Jewish people turn back to Him once again that we see what's going to happen in the end of it. We see that He says, at the end of it all, the Jewish people are going to return to the Lord and say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," according to Matthew chapter 23, verse 39. Okay, so what are we left with at the end of it all? We are left with this 7-year period, and, okay, we understand this from looking at this tonight. At the end of the 7-year period, Jesus is enthroned as Messiah. What this is going to be is the last 7 years before the glorious return of Jesus Christ. And the Bible tells us a lot about what's going to happen in those 7 years. Are you interested? All right, we're going to start talking about that next week. What's going to happen in these 7 years? Yes, Eileen.
So where is it that, it says when Israel comes back to their nation, which was in 1948,
Yes.
that generation shall not pass?
Okay, what you're talking about is what Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse. Okay, maybe we should turn to that passage. Matthew chapter 24. Okay, verse 32. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When the branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. All right, a few things. First of all, what you're talking about understands this passage to mean that the budding of the fig tree is the reestablishment of Israel in 1948. I don't think that that's what Jesus was talking about. Matter of fact, when this parallel passage is recounted in Luke, Jesus puts no emphasis on the fig tree. He says something like this: when you see the fig tree and all the other trees. He's just saying cause and effect. When the bud comes forth, the fruit is going to come out. When you see these signs that I'm speaking of, the end is very near. Now, I think that that's especially something helpful to people in the midst of the Great Tribulation. I believe that some of these passages were written just for people during the Great Tribulation so that they would have hope. And they're going to open their Bible and see the catastrophe happening all around them in the world, and they're going to be able to say, it's not going to last forever, it's going to end soon. This is not going to go on for 100 years like this. It's going to end very soon. That's what Jesus said. It's going to give hope to them. So I don't think that again, some people I know have interpreted that way, that the budding of the fig tree, there was actually a pretty strong belief in the 1980s that the rapture was going to happen in 1981. Okay? And this is how they did the math. They said Israel was established in 1948. How long is a generation? Okay, well, some people say 40 years. Okay, I don't know if you can prove that, but that's what they say. A biblical generation is 40 years. So we'll just throw that out. So 1948, add 40 years, what do you end up with? Okay. Count back 7 years for the Great Tribulation, and what do you have? 1981. So there was a lot of people saying that, hey, the rapture really could happen in 1981. I don't know if you're happy or sad whether or not the rapture did not happen in 1981. But I don't think that the fig tree reference there has to refer to Israel. Plus, when Jesus says this generation will not pass away, the word for generation there can also very easily be understood as this race. I think he's either saying one or two things. Either he's saying to the generation who lives through the Great Tribulation, don't despair, it's going to come to an end soon. This isn't going to wind out forever. Don't be afraid. He's either saying that, or he's saying, I want everybody to know that the Jewish people are not going to be extinguished until all this happens. This race of the Jewish people is not going to pass away until all these things are fulfilled. Okay? Any other questions? Yes, Russ.
Some people think that we're in the tribulation. What triggers that?
Well, it's kind of funny. I think they should just read Matthew chapter 24 better. Because this is what Jesus said. People would know that they were in the midst of the Great Tribulation when they see something that Jesus called, we'll talk about this next week, the abomination of desolation. Very much connected with what Daniel spoke about. Daniel spoke about this abomination, didn't he? Didn't he speak of desolation that followed it? When they saw what Daniel was talking about, people would know, now we are in the Great Tribulation. Jesus said, don't look to wars and rumors of wars. Don't look to persecution. Those things in and of themselves are not the markers of the end. The real marking that you're in the tribulation is the abomination of desolation. So, I don't know. There's been a tendency every time things get really bad in the world for people to think, oh, this must be the end. But you know what? It's obviously not yet. It's not obviously not yet. Okay? What else? Yes?
Observation you can see in a historical concept in the first century when Nero persecutions were going on and the way that the temple was destroyed. There's a lot of Christians thought Jesus would come quickly, that everything was all set up for the same time.
Well, and as I kind of discussed, things were kind of set up for the end times end. We talked about that last week in the program, or in the lecture last week. Yeah, they were kind of set up for the end.
The discourse, I've heard people interpret that as the Christians that were in Jerusalem prior to 70 AD, given a warning that the Romans, and completely evacuated and left it to the Romans to have their way with the Jews and the Christians all left.
Oh, absolutely, it worked out that way. That is absolutely how it worked. Yeah. But it couldn't have been the fulfillment of what Jesus spoke about, because what Jesus said it would end up with didn't end up with. Yeah, exactly. Okay, anything else? Yes, Mickey. Well, yeah, I mean, but we'll talk about the timing of that stuff in future things, about how the rapture fits in. The most important thing we just want to come to tonight is to understand this 7-year block and how important it is in God's plan. There's a 7-year block. Next week, we're going to talk about what happens during the 7-year block, and then the week after that, we'll talk about the rapture and where it fits in to the 7-year block. Okay? All right, look. I got 2 discussion questions for you, and they're pretty important. They're pretty important. Especially the first one. Well, the second one too. Okay? Oh, wait. Let me just show you some of these charts that we did here. This is the 70th week as it lays out. We'll talk about this more. It begins with the Antichrist signing a covenant with Israel. It ends with Jesus returning in glory. In the middle is what we call the abomination of desolation. Okay? That's just sort of a conceptual line of it, right there.
And that has to take place in the temple?
Yes. Yeah, I generally believe so. Daniel's 70 weeks. Wow, this you can't even see this one. What good is this? It's all fancy, but you can't even see it. What good is that? Look all the sophisticated animation going on here. And it's useless. I just have to click through this. I hope something's happening. Come on, get me through this. Oh, there we go. Okay. I think this is the same thing without the background. Okay? 7 weeks. Okay, has everybody got that? 62 weeks. I think this is what we were missing with the previous one. 62 weeks. 1 week at the end. Okay, does everybody see how that lays out? The total is 70 weeks. Antichrist is revealed at the beginning of the 70th week. Jesus returns at the end of the 70th week. Okay? Artaxerxes' decree, right there, March 14th, 4405 C. Jerusalem rebuilt, 396 BC. Triumphal entry. Okay? And then the church age, which I told you I don't particularly like that title. I'd rather call it what? Time of the Gentiles. Okay? See, now that's a pretty good little chart right there. Why they gave it that terrible background before, I don't... Oh, wow, look at this. Wow. Let's just watch it. Wow. Whoa. It's all getting raptured.